Great. Well, thanks everybody for joining. We really appreciate you being here, and we're excited to have the chance to talk to you all about this work. So we're going to be talking to you about two ongoing projects in two areas of New Mexico that are linked by the overarching goal of trying to understand disturbance impacts to salamander populations and their habitat, and also to inform some management needs in terms of those populations. So you're going to hear from both of us. We're going to tag team, take turns throughout this presentation. Nancy has control of the presentation, so she'll be advancing the slides. So with that, Nancy.
There's some trouble with the advancing. Okay, there we go. Okay, so the state of New Mexico has 3 species of salamanders, 2 of which are endemics. Endemic means that that species occurs only in that place in the world. Plethodon neomexicanus is the Jemez Mountain salamander. You can see it there on the left. It occurs in the Jemez Mountains in north central New Mexico and occupies habitats on lands administered by the Department of the Interior, the U.S. Forest Service, Department of Energy, and also on tribal lands. The Sacramento Mountain salamander, Aneides hardii, occurs primarily on the Lincoln National Forest and on the Mescalero Reservation in the White Mountains, Capitan Mountains, and Sacramento Mountains of south central New Mexico. Now, these 2 species are endemics. They occur at high elevations above about 2,500 meters, and we call them relictual species, meaning that they are isolated at these high elevations as a result of past glacial and warming events that have occurred over geologic time. So why these salamanders? Why do we care about these salamanders, and why are we studying them? Well, there are actually 3 species of salamanders that occur in New Mexico. The third is the barred tiger salamander. That species has a broad distribution in the southwestern US and is also relatively abundant where it occurs. These 2 salamanders, the Jemez Mountain salamander and the Sacramento Mountain salamander, are of conservation concern to both state and federal agencies in New Mexico and with the federal agencies. The Jemez Mountain salamander is federally endangered. It was listed in 2013, and the Sacramento Mountain salamander is state threatened. We have concern for these species for a couple reasons, the most important one being that it appears, based on historical records and our current research, that the Jemez Mountain salamander is undergoing severe population declines, and it appears that few populations may remain on the landscape it originally occupied. The Sacramento Mountain salamander seems to be doing a bit better. Populations appear to be stable, but we are aware of some localized declines and possibly some extirpations of populations. There are significant data gaps for each of these species related to their ecology and conservation. Most of the surveys for the Jemez Mountain salamander predated the more recent high severity wildfires. For the Sacramento Mountain salamander, there's simply limited survey data. Fewer surveys were done historically for this species than for the Jemez Mountain salamander. And this information is important for guidance documents that include the recovery plan for the Jemez Mountain salamander, which will begin next year, and also guidance documents regarding forest management, including U.S. Forest Service forest plans and other management plans. But why care about these salamanders at all? Well, terrestrial salamanders, as each of these are important in food webs, and in some food webs and in some regions they may be inordinately important. These salamanders feed on tiny invertebrates that are unavailable to mammals and birds because of their size, and they basically transfer that energy up the food web, offering themselves up as little meat sticks to birds and mammals. They play important roles in controlling detritivore populations, and it's been suspected that for some of these species, they may play important roles in regional carbon cycles, and thus may be ecological indicators. Both species are vulnerable to threats that include climate change, wildfire, disease, forest management, and land use. And there are many important unanswered questions, the answers to which are needed for developing management guidance for both species. So I want to tell you a little bit about the basic biology of these two species so that you understand how they're different from a lot of other salamanders. So both species occur in the family Plethodontidae. That means many-toothed, and indeed they have a lot of tiny teeth. Some species in this family are completely terrestrial, and that may be surprising to you. Many of us think that all amphibians have to use water to breed. But some species in this family, and in particular, the Jemez Mountain salamander and the Sacramento Mountain salamander, are completely terrestrial. They live in forests and they never go to water. In fact, they can drown if they make their way into standing water. All species in this family are lungless. They respire through their skin, and in order to respire, they must have cool, moist conditions at all times. They have direct development, meaning they don't lay eggs in the environment which become larvae. They produce young directly without laying eggs, and they produce young that hatch from eggs as tiny replicas of themselves. In the case of the Jemez Mountain salamander and the Sacramento Mountain salamander, and this isn't specific to the whole family, but just to these two species, we estimate that females reach sexual maturity at about 3 to 4 years and males at 3 years. For two relatively small species, this is quite a lengthy time to sexual maturity. And we know from limited information that they have a maximum lifespan that may extend beyond 14 years. The kinds of macrohabitats they occupy, again, are above elevations of about 2,500 meters in mixed conifer forest, usually mesic mixed conifer forest. The tree species that we see most commonly associated with these forests are Douglas fir, white fir, a couple spruce species, aspen. We often find Rocky Mountain maple at sites occupied by both of these species of salamanders, and Rocky Mountain maple is an indicator of moisture conditions. Historically, these salamanders could be found at lower elevations dominated by ponderosa pine. We don't see that so often today, but occasionally, and we had an exciting discovery last year when we found 3 Jemez Mountain salamanders in a stand that was about 50% Douglas fir and 50% ponderosa pine. So less often in ponderosa pine, which is a drier indicator of drier forests today. In terms of microhabitats, we find these salamanders, these terrestrial salamanders, under downed wood, rocks, pieces of moss, chunks of bark, and even under leaf litter accumulations in the forest. These pictures below show you the kinds of cover objects we can find them beneath. On the left, we have a highly decomposed log. We found a salamander beneath that log. In the center picture, we see layered rock. We found a salamander under those layers of rock. And on the right, we have what we call a nursery log. This is a partly decayed log at one of our sites. And over the span of our research, we have probably found 8 to 10 Jemez Mountain salamanders under this log, including juveniles, young of the year. And that's why we call it a nursery log. We believe that the females are laying eggs either inside it or beneath it, and producing a lot of young around it. This is a particularly important habitat element for these two species. We also find salamanders within decaying logs. We don't make those detections so often anymore. Historically, people would use potato rakes in their surveys for these salamanders and rip logs such as that big Douglas fir log to shreds. We know now that that's not helpful for the habitat of these species, so we don't tear logs apart anymore. Occasionally when we turn a log over, part of it will break and we'll find a salamander if it's our lucky day. The important thing about these microhabitat elements that we call cover objects is that their presence helps to maintain suitable microclimate, including suitable temperature and moisture beneath or within those cover objects. And microclimate is exceedingly important for both of these species. I mentioned earlier that these species are lungless, and in order for cutaneous respiration to occur, suitable temperature and moisture are required at sites occupied by these salamanders. Now, here are some data for the Jemez Mountain salamander. We don't have comparable data yet for the Sacramento Mountain salamander, but we are currently collecting it. This study from Coomer 2003 documented temperatures beneath and inside of cover objects and found a range of 16 to 17 degrees Celsius and a mean of 12.7 degrees Celsius associated with those cover objects. In terms of soil moisture, beneath cover objects, the range was 5 to 60% and a mean of 20%. We're doing more intensive monitoring of microclimate associated with cover objects in our study, and we hope to expand on this information very soon. I want to give you a little bit of information about the history of research on these two species of salamanders and what we know about their population trajectories. Now, this is historical data from Natural Heritage New Mexico for each of the species. So the caveats I want to offer up here are that these data this database only includes data that was submitted by people historically willing to submit the data, and it likely does not include all of the instances in which somebody went out and did a survey and found no salamanders. Most of the records here, especially for the Sacramento Mountain salamander, include efforts to survey salamanders in which salamanders were found. So the inferences we can make from the data in this database from the historical records are limited, but we think they're valuable nonetheless. So let me go through this. For the Jemez Mountain salamander, Natural Heritage New Mexico has records of surveys from 1949 to present. But what I'm going to show here are records through 2016. In the database, there are records of 1,326 surveys that occurred. And through those surveys, 4,408 salamanders were detected. Now, I've cherry-picked from this database. The reason I cherry-picked is I only want us to select dates in which at least 10 surveys had occurred in a year to try to impose some equitability on what I'm presenting. There are some years where there's a single survey done, so it wouldn't be fair to show that. But you can see in 1970 for the Jemez Mountain salamander, 659 salamanders were detected. And you can see for each of those years, declining numbers of salamanders detected up to 2016 when only 24 salamanders were observed. For the Sacramento Mountain salamander, surveys exist in the database from 1940 to present. But again, I'm going to only report up to 2016 here. Only 169 surveys occurred during that time period for the Sacramento Mountain salamander, and only 693 salamanders were detected. Now, you could look at this information and you could think, wow, Sacramento Mountain salamanders must be really rare, but we think we have something else to share with you. In 1958, 53 salamanders were detected. You can see there's a spike the next year in 1987 when there were actually more surveys conducted. Numbers dropped down again when there were fewer surveys. 2016, our colleague Sammy Cordova did extensive surveys and she detected 193 salamanders. So what I would say here is what we know from historical records and our more recent surveys is that Jemez Mountain salamanders appear to be better studied, but we think their populations may be declining. And again, survey effort is not known for earlier data, so it's really hard to compare our current numbers to historic numbers or even among historic numbers.
Okay, well, so as Nancy just mentioned, survey efforts and probably also survey methods, definitely survey methods have varied across this period of record, which makes it a little bit hard to pin down population trajectories. But what we do know is that over the past 100 years or more in the Southwest, and you probably know this too, living and working here, those of you who do, that over the past 100+ years, there have been major changes in human activities and also in landscapes of the Southwest that have impacted the ranges and the habitats for these two species. And so if we just look at the historical impacts, we see big changes in landscapes because of logging. This graph that's present on this slide, which is from a research bulletin from the Forest Service in 1966, shows the number of million board feet harvested from New Mexico versus all mountain states versus the US. And so we have a couple upticks in New Mexico, particularly in the Jemez Mountains. Logging started in earnest in the 1920s and then sort of flatlined. And then again in the 1950s, throughout all of New Mexico, logging, especially in the dry to dry music forests, in which some of these salamander populations reside, were really severely harvested. We also see an impact of grazing, and I want to give you some numbers that I found. So in terms of cattle grazing for all of New Mexico, in 1870, there were 138,000 head of cattle grazing in public lands in New Mexico. By 1880, just 10 years later, there were 445,000 head. By 1886, there were over 1 million cattle grazing in public lands in New Mexico. And in terms of sheep numbers, in 1882, there were 5.2 million sheep grazing on public lands in New Mexico alone. And so what that means for landscapes is a huge amount of erosion, major changes in vegetation, and then also changes in fire regimes. So particularly a cessation of the low severity, high frequency fire that maintained many of our forests. We also see an impact of urbanization and habitat fragmentation. So road building associated with wildland-urban interface development, with recreation, with resource extraction, a whole host of changes in land use that affect forest cover, that affect cover objects on the ground, affect soil moisture and temperature, all the things that we know to be important for salamanders. And then particularly with Jemez Mountain salamanders, there's an impact of museum collection. So there are over 2,000 Jemez Mountain salamanders in museum collections as specimens around the US. And so if you think back to those numbers that Nancy just shared in terms of detections for Jemez Mountain salamanders, those 2,000 individual specimens, while providing some benefit to our understanding of science biology of salamanders, do represent quite a big a number to remove from the population. Next slide. Thanks. And so more recently, we've seen some other changes in impacts and disturbances that are likely to carry on to the future. If you've ever heard me give any talks before, I often refer to the two areas where I work most, both New Mexico and Alaska, as ecosystems on the edge. And most certainly when it comes to these salamanders and their habitats, our landscapes in New Mexico, our southwestern ecosystems, are absolutely ecosystems on the edge. So in terms of climate changes, what we have seen, what we are likely to continue to see into the future is a persistent long-term drought that results in lower snowpack. We often see weaker, patchy monsoon seasons. Monsoon rains for us deliver a really critical load of moisture for salamanders and for the forests on which they depend. We see warmer air temperatures. If you think back to to Nancy's slide about microclimatic conditions for salamanders. That's not a good sign. We see that those things result in drier soils, drier logs, cover objects. And we see an increase in forest insect and pathogen mortality. So tree death that changes the overall architecture and composition of our forests. And so, so those things are all having an impact, not just on the sort of the primary forest composition and structure, but that composition and structure as it relates to salamander habitat and microhabitat. Next slide, please. And of course, wildfires, which is a research passion for most of us, have been changing over the past century or more. I talked about grazing impacts on low severity wildfires. We also see, of course, an impact of fire exclusion, removing that component of low severity, high frequency wildfire from our forests. The fires that burn now often burn with much larger patches of high severity fire than in the past. We see fires that burn outside of the historical fire period. So fires that start earlier in the year, burn for a longer period of time, burn later into the year. In the Jemez Mountains in particular, we see an effect of repeat high severity fires. So wildfires, and in some areas we have four repeat fires within the past couple of decades. So each subsequent fire of a high burn severity happening over and over and over again. And those things result, those wildfire patterns result in changes in forest structure and composition as well. So if we just look at the Jemez Mountains in terms of these wildfire patterns, this image on the right is a fire history map over the decades from 1909 to 2013, showing wildfire events in those decades. The red polygons are from the period 2010 to 2013. And so, of course, we have a long history of widespread fire in the Jemez Mountains that predates by millennia this particular map. But in terms of our recent fire history, in the period of fire suppression, we see an enormous amount of wildfire that has essentially escaped those suppression activities to burn over a huge amount of the Jemez Mountains, which also includes a huge amount of the core habitat or critical habitat for the Jemez Mountains salamander. I should point out, so we have fire polygons on this map. And again, the red ones are the most recent fires, but there are also lots of little dots throughout this map. And those are just the ignitions that were essentially suppressed before they had time to become, aerial wildfires with an aerial extent. Next slide, please. So these disturbances of climate and of wildfire don't occur in isolation to one another. Their impacts certainly can happen in a singular manner, but probably more importantly for our ecosystems is the effect of disturbance synergies. So when something like changing climate interacts with wildfire and or with something like beetle-caused forest mortality, to really amplify the amount of disturbance, the magnitude of disturbance, and the pace of disturbance on our landscapes. And so this is one of the things that we're really trying to tease apart with this project that we're doing, is how these sort of disturbance complexes or disturbance synergies interact together. But what we do know is that their cumulative or combined impacts are to cause, first of all, the potential for direct mortality on salamanders. So especially when we talk about fire, fire brings heat, fire brings dryness to soils, and the soil and temperature or moisture and temperature conditions under which these salamanders can survive is relatively narrow when you compare it to the heat pulse from a fire. So we can see direct mortality, especially during certain times of the year when salamanders might have a period of surface activity, which they need to do to eat and to reproduce. We can see increased disease susceptibility of salamanders. When individuals become stressed, they become more susceptible to mortality from disease, and there is amphibian disease within their range to which they may be susceptible. We see disturbance synergies causing major changes in habitat. So loss of forest cover, loss of those cover objects, the wood-based cover objects, alteration of those microclimatic gradients that are so important for salamanders. A longer period of aridity during their surface active period can have a big impact. And then importantly, changes to invertebrate populations that can happen as a result of wildfires or as a result of climate changes interacting with wildfires. And those invertebrate populations in the soils provide the prey base for salamanders. So if there are big changes in arthropod or microarthropod communities in the soils, those represent big changes in the diets or the potential for resource accumulation by these salamanders. And then one thing that we always need to think of when it comes to disturbance, and particularly wildfire, is that the trade-off between the risk of wildfire and particularly high severity wildfire and fires that stick around throughout a big portion of the year and cause deep soil impacts versus the potential impacts of fuels management activities. So in fuels management activities, some of the fuels that we would remove from, say, a treatment unit represent cover objects that are important for salamanders. But yet, if we don't treat some of those fuels, we run the risk of a future high severity wildfire that will also have impacts. And so, so again, one of the focal areas of our work is just trying to think about what those trade-offs might be and how we might balance, the alteration of fuels and stand structure to better be able to restore fire to the landscape while not causing undue harm to these populations and their habitats. Next slide, please. Okay, so I wanted to touch here, we wanted to touch on some of the major goals of the project, and I just sort of described their relevance, but really the overarching framework of our study is to conduct identical studies on the Jemez Mountain salamander and the Sacramento Mountain salamander. And the reason that those two species and these two studies are really well paired is that, as you saw in those numbers before, Jemez Mountain salamanders appear to be experiencing population declines and changes in habitat that are perhaps more profound or severe or more impactful to them than those in Sacramento Mountain salamanders. So what we learn from Jemez Mountain salamanders, sort of our canary in the coal mine, may be able to preempt those same declines in Sacramento Mountain salamanders to keep them from federal listing status, to be able to protect or preserve or restore some of the habitat elements that may have been lost in Jemez Mountain salamanders or for Jemez Mountain salamanders that are still present in the Lincoln National Forest where Sacramento Mountain salamanders are. So we need to understand the drivers of population declines in Jemez Mountain salamanders to be able to do that, and then to provide management recommendations for fire fuels and forest management. Next slide, please. So specifically, we're asking these research questions with this long-running project. So first of all, what the population sizes and trajectories are for the remaining populations of both species. For both, we're interested if there are population declines, indeed, that we're detecting, what the drivers of those declines are. So individual disturbances, complexes of disturbances, are there places on the landscape where complexes versus individual disturbances play out differently? How has habitat suitability changed over time? So we see changes in forest structure and composition. How does that translate to this habitat suitability? We're interested in seeing whether wildfire burn severity influences persistence at sites that were historically occupied, where we do repeat surveys. So what is the influence of burn severity on the potential for those areas to support populations through time? And then finally, how fuels reduction activities like thinning and prescribed burning affect populations, and how we might sort of work in those ideas of the trade-offs that I talked about. So treating in a manner that protects against future disturbance while not doing undue harm to current populations and habitats.
Okay, to address these research questions, we're taking two approaches. One approach we're calling demography surveys, and this is where we have plots established at salamander hotspots. And specifically, I'm talking about Jemez Mountain salamander in this specific example. But again, these the methods we're using for the Jemez Mountain salamander are identical for the Sacramento Mountain salamander. So these demography surveys are occurring at established plots, which occur on salamander hotspots that have been surveyed for years and years and years, and they seem to represent stable populations on the landscape, or at least relatively stable. For the Jemez Mountain salamander, these sites are at Oat and Pony Canyons on the Santa Fe National Forest and at Redondo Border on Valles Caldera National Preserve. At each of these sites, we've set up 3 50 by 50 meter plots, and each of these plots has a weather station associated with it. And I'll give you more details about the weather stations in a minute. For each site, we do and each plot, we do biweekly salamander surveys. And that basically means starting at one edge of the plot, starting our time, and people moving, sweeping across the plot, turning logs, turning rocks, bark, chunks of moss, looking in leaf litter and searching for salamanders. When we find salamanders, we measure them, weigh them, determine the sex of them. A very titillating paper on how to determine sex in the Jemez Mountain salamander will be coming out very soon by us. And then these salamanders, we mark them as individuals so that we can determine whether or not we've found them before and what their identity is. We use PID tags, which are a tiny microchip the size of a grain of rice, which we inject subcutaneously. We do that on adults. For smaller individuals, we inject visual implant elastomer, which is a fluorescent polymer. We inject that subcutaneously in a particular pattern on the ventral surface to identify individuals. We release the salamanders where we found them under the cover object under which they were found or within which they were found, and then we record a series of habitat attributes. So that's one approach to address our research questions. The other entails occupancy surveys. So these are conducted at sites that we know to have been historically occupied by salamanders. And at these sites, we go to the location where the historical detection was, and we conduct a 2-person-hour survey along within that area. And these surveys are conducted along a burn severity gradient, meaning that we conduct surveys at sites that are unburned, sites that have burned at low to moderate severity, and sites that have burned at high severity. So we can assess the effects of burn severity on salamander populations. And we conduct this work in about the same way in terms of processing the salamanders, except we don't mark salamanders in these occupancy surveys. We do collect habitat data at these sites where salamanders are found. And so in terms of the demography surveys, we're going to be able to use the data obtained from those surveys in population models to estimate population sizes and trajectories and look at important demographic factors such as sex ratio and age class structure of those populations. In terms of the occupancy surveys, we will use those to get at how burn severity of wildfires is impacting salamanders and to try to understand what proportion of historically occupied sites still continue to support salamander populations. In terms of microclimate monitoring at the demography plots, so this work, weather stations are established only at the demography plots. At each demography plot, we have Hobo 5-channel data loggers collecting data every 30 minutes. And these weather stations were installed in 2020, have been collecting data continuously since then. At these sites, we're collecting data on rainfall, surface temperature, and relative humidity. And then we are also collecting information on data on the microclimate beneath rock and log cover objects. You can see in the picture on the left our rain gauge, and on the right is our relative humidity sensor. We've instrumented one representative rock cover object within each plot to assess microclimate beneath that rock. In this case, you can see in that lower left picture, we've turned over a rock that represents the kind of rocks that we find salamanders under. We've deployed a soil moisture sensor at 2 centimeters and 10 centimeters beneath, below the ground surface under that rock, and a temperature sensor immediately adjacent to it. After we embed these sensors in the soil, we turn the rock back over, and you can see on the rock, on the picture on the right, the rock is off to the far right. We've got our hobo station there, and the wire that the wire mesh that you see there is just protecting our wires from rodents in the forest. We also build a wire cage around all of this to try to protect it from some things, but of course, bears and elk occasionally take their toll. Okay, in terms of the log cover objects, we are measuring temperature within the log cover object. You can see that in the picture on the right. We've drilled a hole into the center of a log that represents the type of log that we could find salamanders under or within. In this case, that sensor is going into the middle of the log in a place where we could expect to find a salamander, and that is monitoring temperature only. We're unable to measure moisture within the log using these types of sensors. And then beneath that log, we've embedded, again, soil moisture and soil temperature sensors. For soil moisture, we're measuring it at 2 centimeters and 10 centimeters below the ground surface, and temperature only at 2 centimeters below the ground surface. We had to give up one temperature sensor with this setup to put that sensor inside the log. Okay, in terms of our preliminary results, we've actually been conducting this study since 2020, but I'm only going to report here data from 2021 and 2022. In 2020, we worked solely on the Jemez Mountains salamander, and our graduate student, Marissa Ardavino, who is actually on this call today, I want to give a shout out to, she assisted us with our work previously with the Jemez Mountain salamander and is now leading the field project on the Sacramento Mountain salamander. But for the sake of, for comparative sake, we've been working on both species since 2020 and 2021. So I'm just going to present those data here. So there was comparable survey effort for each species in both of those years. For the Jemez Mountain salamander, we had only 64 detections across those 2 years. And in terms of our surveys at historically occupied sites, we found salamanders at 7 of 113 sites, or 6% of those sites. For the Sacramento Mountain salamander, and again, this is the project being led by Marissa Ardavino, we had a total of 1,122 detections of salamanders, and about 57% of the historically occupied sites still support salamander populations. So even though these results are preliminary, we can probably draw out a few patterns here. And I'm going to report here just about the Jemez Mountain salamander because this is the species that we are concerned with. Based on the data we've been collecting over the past 3 years for the Jemez Mountain salamander, it appears that very few historically occupied sites are currently occupied. And this, of course, translates to population declines. You can see the picture off on the right. This is a site that was historically occupied by salamanders. We've mentioned a few times that the forest aids in maintaining suitable microclimate for these for the Jemez Mountain salamander, which is essential for respiration in the species and maintenance of populations. When a forest is converted from a dense, largely closed canopy, mature forest to this following wildfire, these salamanders simply fail to persist. So we suspect that population declines have occurred in the Jemez Mountain salamander, even though we're not completely done with our mark recapture study yet. The remaining populations occur in hotspots, and these are places such as Oat-and-Pony Canyon on the Santa Fe National Forest, a Redondo border on Baez Caldera. These hotspots are vulnerable to potential habitat changes from wildfires, and these are the places where considering fuels management is really important. We know that there's a relationship between soil moisture that's associated with precipitation levels and salamander surface activity, and that's something we're continuing to monitor extensively. We find very few salamanders in places that have burned at high severity, but we want to caution there's a history of disturbance on these lands and that fire is not the only driver of population declines, although it may be a particularly important driver more recently.
Okay, so we want to end with some examples of the applications of this ongoing research to land management. So first of all, with the Jemez Mountain salamander, this research that we're doing is directly informing the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service species status assessment, which is in process, and Nancy is a key member of the species status assessment team, and then what will be the species recovery plan, so upcoming. And those two documents are extremely important in guiding Endangered Species Act listing for this species. And then for Sacramento Mountain salamander, the Lincoln National Forest is in the midst of plan revision. And also, as you saw from some of the previous slides, the Natural Heritage New Mexico database has sparse records for Aneides hardii, Sacramento Mountain salamander. And so these data that we're collecting in the project Marissa's leading are going to bolster that record. And then for both species, the work that we're doing is relevant to district level fuels treatment and prescribed fire planning, both for how to treat and how to manage critical and potential salamander habitat, but then also how to sort of foster the coexistence between an endangered or a threatened species in the context of landscape scale fuels treatments. And then as part of this and another project, this research in general provides inputs for predictive models for future habitat suitability and occupancy, given these ongoing changes in climate and potential changes in disturbance regimes. And I want to leave you, if we go to the next slide, with just one example of a very applied focal area of this project, and that's looking at weather slash piles, which are kind of an important tool in managing fuels and fuels removal, whether those slash piles can provide or do provide habitat for salamanders. And this is a project that we've done on the Lincoln National Forest and hope to replicate in the Jemez Mountains for Jemez Mountain salamanders. And so what we've done in the Lincoln is to do a sort of a pilot project in one treatment unit where we measured characteristics of slash piles and their surrounding environment, surveyed for salamanders, measured all the attributes of those piles from individual logs to the entire pile geometry, compared the presence of salamanders, and there were salamanders, in those piles with the presence under nearby cover objects in the entire treatment unit, with a variety of survey methods. And then the goal is to track those piles through time when they're burned, to monitor fire behavior characteristics, so radiant heat in all directions transmitted down through the soil, and then also resurvey after piles, since often there's incomplete combustion, to see what the occupancy of those piles is post-burning as compared with the surrounding environment. And so what this study does is basically give some information to forests to help them evaluate when to burn, how to construct piles, and basically how to think about these species in the context of this, important tool for fuels and fire management. So with that, we want to acknowledge a whole variety of funding sources. We have important funding from the New Mexico Share with Wildlife program. We have some funding from the National Park Service over the past couple of years. USGS, U.S. Forest Service, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have all provided funding and some research collaborators, technicians over the years. And then we want to thank Marissa Arvino on this call, who is the graduate student who's again running the Lincoln National Forest, Sacramento Mountain salamander part of the project. We have a whole host of collaborators in the U.S. Forest Service. You see their names there, in Park Service and with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Sammy Cordova, who is a wildlife biologist who worked for a long time in the Jemez Mountains and now is doing equally important work as the lead science teacher at Jefferson Middle School, is an important part of our research team. And then over the years, we've had just a whole bunch of really dedicated, passionate field technicians who have helped make our work fun, but also really contributed to this research. And so we thank all of them as well. And I think with that, we can take any questions from you all, hopefully have a discussion.
Great, thank you so much for the excellent presentation, both of you. We'll go ahead and kick it off with a question from Dawn, although I am going to offer up to everyone, since we have a pretty small group today, if folks want to unmute and pose your questions that way, that's fine as well, so feel free to. So Dawn asked, in the end, what do you think is the balance of impacts of wildfire compared to climate change alone on the long-term future of these cool animals? Also, what is their dispersal ability to keep up with shifting climate zones?
I guess I'll take a stab at this. Good question, Don. It's nice to kind of see you finally. Let me do the dispersal one first, because that's the easier one. The home range of this salamander is about, or the average movement distance in a year of the Jemez Mountain salamander is about 5 meters. So they are very limited in their capacity for dispersal, and just about everything creates a barrier for them. A break in the forest canopy can be a barrier. So they occur, as I'm sure you know, on the top of Redondo Peak, which is second highest mountain in the Jemez Mountains. And so they have nowhere to move up and they have nowhere to move across, so they're sort of stuck. And then in terms of the balance of vulnerability of either salamander to climate change or fire, I guess that's a tough question. I'll let Rachel take a stab after I take a terrible. She's very excited. We know far less about how climate change is impacting these salamanders, but we do know that microclimate is a really important feature of their environment and the ability for populations to persist. And so wildfire removes forest canopy, which impacts or reduces forest canopy, which impacts the microclimate. Climate change dries forests and impacts their microclimate. So both of them should have an effect. I don't think that at this point we don't know the answer. Hopefully in a few years we'll have a little bit of a lead on that, but I'll let Rachel take a stab.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know that I have too much more to add, except that just sort of anecdotally, one of the things that's really surprised us in doing our surveys, I think for both, it's safe to say for both species, is when we go to a place that's been impacted by high severity wildfire, and particularly repeat high severity wildfire, it's never a surprise if it's not a surprise to us if we don't find salamanders, right? You go to a place where there was dense forest canopy, mapped as, critical habitat at one point pre-fire. And now, there's very little organic matter in the soil. There's no canopy. There's lots of wood on the ground, but it's charred. It's sort of biologically unavailable in many ways. It's not a surprise that we don't find salamanders in those burned areas. What is a surprise to us is when we go to forested stands that still have that sort of classic mesic mixed conifer canopy structure and composition that appear cool and moist, that appear to not be impacted by wildfire disturbance or other visible disturbances, insect activity, tree mortality. Over the past couple decades, there were historical detections in those areas, and we don't find salamanders. And so that's the surprising thing. And so that's what makes us think that there are things happening in the life history, in the habitat of these salamanders that's not related to wildfire disturbance alone. And so I could tell you lots of ideas about what we think those things are. I think it's probably sort of again a disturbance complex from soil to atmosphere interacting to influence everything from prey base to microclimate that's playing out in some cases because of climate changes alone, and probably because of climate changes that are happening over a period of years or decades and not just one season at a time.
I want to just add one more thing before we hear from Ellis. But one other thing that's surprising to us and hopeful is that a couple times each year we go to a historically occupied site that's burned at high severity, and lo and behold, we find a salamander. And that's what gives us hope that these populations may be slightly more resilient than we give them credit for, and hopeful that potentially with some habitat restoration, we can also restore the populations. And Ellis, it's nice to see you too. So let's hear from you.
Great, thanks for a good presentation, and hopefully we can follow up later, seeing that there's 3 minutes till the end of the hour. Two questions. I'll start with the first one, probably won't have time for the second one. First is just about detection. My understanding is that these things lived in these rocks, interstitial spaces under rocks, and maybe they only come up to surface at certain points and during certain drought years. So I'm just curious, how well do you think you guys are actually able to detect these critters?
Well, it's a great question. Detection probability is a huge issue, as I'm sure you know, for rare species or declining populations. So with our demography plots, we're visiting those 5 times a year, and we regularly find salamanders in each of the plots, even for the Jemez Mountains salamander. Those, of course, are at the hot spots that you're familiar with. For the occupancy surveys, we've been doing a few things. Marissa, on her work on the Sacramento Mountain salamander, is using a newer occupancy approach called time to detection. Salamanders are more abundant down there, as I'm sure you know, and so we're recording time to first detection during those occupancy surveys, and that will be the metric rather than 1 or 0. For the Jemez Mountain salamander, Rachel and I are actually launching a new study this summer for our occupancy surveys, in which we're going to be visiting historically occupied sites 5 or 6 times in a season. Detection probability is a huge issue, especially for the Jemez Mountain salamander, and given the long period, even during the monsoon season, long periods of drier conditions in which the conditions aren't really suitable for doing surveys, but we have to do them anyway. So we're trying to tackle that with some new work this year.
Cool. I'll give the floor to anyone else. There's time.
Ellis, I would say go ahead and pose your second question if you would like to.
All right. Cool. Well, the one, it's a little more complex, I guess. How do you reconcile the known changes in forest composition, right? These forests, especially these hotspots, doubled in density based on our reconstructions. They used to burn, even in these wet places. I was totally surprised. We found fire scars. They used to burn less than 25, year intervals. And so I get the sense that these logs that these things live in now probably weren't there as much historically. And so there's this quandary, right? I mean, this is always a quandary with endangered species management as our systems change. And so I'm just curious if you have any quick thoughts on how to reconcile those changes with the endangered status.
Well, you raise a really important question. This is one that Rachel and I talk about and fret about all the time. And so partly what I think Ellis is getting at is the notion that there historically have been lots of large, we might call them old growth logs, large diameter logs on the ground, partly because of salamanders, hunters. A lot of those logs have been ripped to shreds. And so even though there's recruitment of logs into these forests, those logs are much smaller, in part because of age, partly because of competition densities of trees within these forests. So, so the quality of the habitat that remains for these salamanders and is being recruited into these forests is much poorer for the salamanders. And so somehow we're going to have to combat that issue, because we are never going to get trees again the sizes of the ones that we had historically. So we're going to be dealing with smaller types of cover objects. Of course, the rocks aren't ever going to go away, so those will remain there. And other things like bark and moss mats seem to be important in some places. We don't have a good handle on that yet. But let Rachel, did you want to add to that?
Ellis, is part of what you're saying the idea that we have an increase, a potential increase in the number or the retention of cover objects because we're in a period of fire exclusion, and so we may be underestimating the role of fire in those habitat areas?
And I would guess actually that I would think that there would be less woody material on the ground. You showed that historical photo and you go to a place like the Gila, and what strikes you is there's no wood on the ground. It's burned up, right? And so, I mean, now these things are in these logs, but I think that maybe there was an art of, if you could track the number of logs on the ground, I would guess that it probably peaked in the 70s, 80s, into the 90s, you know, before the places started burning now. But I'm guessing there's probably more logs, which these things like now, than there were historically, because it used to burn.
Yeah. So I think there's probably not one clear-cut answer, and I'm thinking to all of our study plots and the places we've gone, and also the behavior and the impacts of fires in the Jemez Mountains. And so we have this, and actually this is something that we talk about with regard to these repeat fires. Is, you know, the first fire, let's say the first high severity fire, like Dome, Cerro Grande, wherever you're looking, you know, that fire, it may kill all of the trees or most of the trees in a stand, but it doesn't consume all those trees, right? It puts them down on the ground as large logs. So high severity fire, you know, post high severity fire time step one, you recruit in a whole bunch of logs that at some point can become cover objects, right? I mean, initially they're intact. They don't have a decay. They don't have a firm contact with the soil. They're not creating that microhabitat, right? But they will eventually, whether it's like one tree falling in a forest or 100 trees falling in a forest. The second fire comes along, high severity fire, layered on top of the Dome or the Cerro Grande or whichever one it is, or those two with a third layer on top. You see consumption of those large logs because they're on the soil, they're dry, or they're on the forest floor, or what was the forest floor, they're drier. We have a bunch of shrub growth, you know, fine fuel availability that's basically creating the conditions under which they can burn. So that's like the double whammy, right? So there was cover object recruitment, and then those objects consumed huge heat pulse into the soil. So that kind of repeat fire, that high severity repeat fire event, that was probably the thing that absolutely didn't occur, right, in the historical fire regime for these salamanders. The other part about whether we're maybe overemphasizing, I think is what you're saying, the importance of log cover objects because those are a more contemporary artifact, right? Well, so in all of the places where we've surveyed on the Jemez Mountains, rock cover objects are an important part of the cover object portfolio. One of the things that we didn't talk about because we didn't have time in this talk and we're still collecting data, is the differences in soil moisture and temperature in logs versus rocks. And they do actually act really differently in a way that's pretty cool. So the retention of moisture and the maintenance of a temperature profile is quite different between the two. And so they would act maybe differently at different times of the year. So both could be important, but in different ways. I think, if we see an overall warming and drying of soils, not just because of ongoing climate changes, but because of this incredible densification of the number of straws in the landscape that are drawing moisture out of the soil, that probably changes the importance of those cover objects to salamanders in terms of their activity. So I think we can't do that sort of one-on-one analog, but it's complicated to tease apart. It's like job security for all of us forever, but we should all stick our heads together and talk about this more.
And the other thing I would add to that is that all the sites we survey have wood, not all the sites we survey have rock. So that's an important thing we have to keep in mind.
We have this systems diagram that we made. I thought briefly like, wow, maybe we should show it, but it has about 800 boxes and about 2,000 arrows connecting all those boxes. But that is the complexity of this system. Job security.
All right, so we'll take one more question. I know that I have a bunch in my head that I wish we could get to, but just a few more moments. Carla asked, sort of tagging off the last question in this bit of discussion, can you talk about the role of canopy cover in habitat suitability and whether overstory, mid/understory, or grass cover is most important?
That's a great question. And it harkens back to my master's degree, which was on a similar salamander in Northern California. One of the things I've spent a lot of time thinking about is that notion of buffer capacity, depending on what the overstory is. And what I think we understand for plethodonid salamanders, these lungless salamanders, is that overstory canopy is what's most important, because that gives the greatest buffering effect of those warmer conditions and of direct solar radiation. So I say that, but again, it in part depends on what the types of cover objects are on the forest floor. So a mid-story canopy might be sufficient if you have a lot of large, wet, downed logs. And even Jemez Mountain salamanders have been found in meadows where the only canopy is grassland, where there are large, wet, downed logs. So that can happen occasionally, but I think it's that overstory canopy that's most important for maintaining the microclimate these salamanders need. Rachel, did you want to add to that?
All right, well, thank you so much both. In your research that's coming up and ready to be published, I really hope we can see some recommendations of fuel management techniques that are going to be most important for conserving these populations. And I just really look forward to hearing more about this research. So thank you so much for coming on today, for giving us your time, and I look forward to tracking you in the future.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Rachel. See you.
Yeah, bye-bye.